"You knew this whole time," she said, her voice barely holding steady. "You knew what your family was doing to mine, and you said nothing." He didn't look away from her, which somehow made it worse. "It was not my decision," he said quietly. "Then whose decision was it?" she asked. "When you sat across from my father and shook his hand and promised him this marriage would save what was left of his name. I am not going to tell you yet whether she walks away from this marriage or burns it to the ground from the inside, because the truth is, I have not decided how much mercy she deserves to show a family that showed her none. What I will tell you is that this story is about the exact moment a woman stops being useful to people and starts being dangerous to them instead. And if any part of you has ever been treated like a bargaining chip in someone else's deal, you already know where this is going. So, what do you think? Does she leave with nothing but her name intact? Or does she take everything they have on her way out the door? You can also tell me about a time you were treated as leverage instead of a person, and what it cost the people who did it. Drop where you are watching from tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, we are exactly the kind of person this family underestimated, so do not make the same mistake they did. Now, back to our story. Rome sat quietly outside the tall windows of her father's study, though it might as well have been any city on any night, since none of it had ever felt like home the way people meant when they said that word. Renee stood near the door, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching her father sign the last page of a document he had clearly not wanted to sign. The room smelled of old paper and the cheap coffee her father had been drinking all week, instead of sleeping, and the lamp on his desk cast a small, tired circle of light over the contract that was about to reshape both their lives. "You are giving me away like I am a piece of the debt itself," she said quietly. Her father did not look up from the paper. "It is not like that," he said, though his voice carried none of the conviction the words needed. "Then tell me what it is like," she said, stepping closer to the desk. "Tell me what word describes a father trading his daughter to make his creditors go away." He set the pen down slowly and finally met her eyes, and what she saw there was not cruelty, but something worse. A man who had already made peace with the thing he was about to do. "I owe the Hahn family more than this house is worth," he said. "More than the business is worth. More than I can ever repay in the years I have left. They offered a way out, and the way out is you." "You could have refused," Renee said, her voice tightening. "I could have watched everything your mother and I built collapse instead," he said. "I could have watched you lose your home along with your future. This way, at least you keep one of them." Renee felt something cold settle behind her ribs, a feeling she suspected she would need to get used to. "And which one do I keep?" she asked. "My home or my future?" Her father did not answer, because they both already understood there was no honest answer that did not make him a coward. He looked back down at the papers instead, straightening them into a neat stack, as though order on the desk might somehow translate into order in the rest of their lives. "There is still time to change your mind," Renee said quietly, though she already knew the answer before he gave it. "There is not," he said. "The papers are signed the moment I hand them over tomorrow. After that, this is no longer a discussion. It is simply what will happen." She left the study without another word, because there was nothing left to say that would change anything, and she spent that night lying awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at a ceiling she had memorized as a girl, trying to imagine a version of her future that did not belong to strangers. The meeting with the Hahn family was arranged for 3 days later, in a private dining room at a restaurant so exclusive it did not bother with a sign out front, and Renee spent the drive over rehearsing a version of herself calm enough to survive whatever waited inside. Her father sat beside her in the back of the car, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, his hands not quite steady. "You do not have to say much tonight," he told her. "Just be polite. Let the men speak." Renee said nothing, watching the city blur past the window, already understanding that her silence tonight was simply a smaller version of the silence that would define the rest of her marriage. The restaurant's private room was dim and elegant, all dark wood and low lighting, and the man who rose to greet her father was not what she expected. He was young, sharply dressed in a dark tailored suit, with the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller the moment he entered it. the particular quiet of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. "This is my daughter Renee," her father said, and she caught the slight tremor beneath his formal tone. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression giving away nothing. "I am Jin Ho," he said simply, without offering a hand, without any of the small warmth a stranger might extend to a woman he was about to marry. "My father sends his regrets that he could not be here tonight. Business in another city." Renee inclined her head, refusing to let her voice shake. "It is a pleasure," she said, though the words tasted like ash on her tongue. They sat. The conversation that followed belonged entirely to the two older men present, an uncle standing in for Jinho's father, and Renee's own father across the table. Terms and figures and conditions passed back and forth like Renee was furniture in the room, rather than the subject of the arrangement itself. She caught fragments of it: shipping routes, port access, a percentage that would be forgiven against a percentage that would remain, and she understood distantly that she was worth less in this conversation than the numbers being discussed around her. "I want to be clear about what this is," Jinho said eventually, turning his attention to her directly for the first time since the introductions, his dark eyes assessing her without any real curiosity behind them. "This marriage secures an alliance my father wants with your father's shipping routes. It is not a romance. I will expect you to conduct yourself appropriately in public, and beyond that, I do not intend for either of us to complicate what is fundamentally a business arrangement." Renee held his gaze, refusing to be the one who looked away first. "And if I have expectations of my own," she said evenly. Jinho's expression did not change. "Then I suggest you adjust them," he said, "before this goes any further." Her father shifted uncomfortably beside her, but said nothing, and Renee understood in that moment exactly how little her comfort would matter to either man at this table for the remainder of her life. She thought briefly of arguing further, of demanding some acknowledgement that she was a person and not a line item, but the stillness in Jinho's face told her clearly that nothing she said tonight would change the shape of what was already decided. "I understand perfectly," she said, and something in her tone must have carried more edge than she intended, because Jinho studied her for a beat longer than the moment required, as though recalculating something about her. "We agreed, then," he said, and turned back to her father to finish discussing terms that had nothing to do with her happiness, and everything to do with numbers on a ledger. The wedding took place 11 days later, in a private hall owned by the Han family, attended by a small gathering of relatives and business associates who treated the entire event with the enthusiasm of people signing a contract rather than witnessing a union. There were no close friends present, no laughter that reached past politeness, only the low murmur of people making calculations about what this marriage meant for their own standing. Renee wore a gown selected by Jinho's mother, a woman whose smile never once reached her eyes throughout the fitting, who adjusted the hem with sharp, efficient movements and said only that the color would photograph well, as though the wedding's sole purpose was documentation rather than celebration. "You will find your place here eventually," the woman said at one point, not quite looking at Renee in the mirror's reflection. "Most of them do." Renee did not ask what she meant by most of them, though the phrase settled uneasily in her chest, and stayed there through the rest of the fitting, a small cold stone she would carry into the ceremony itself. The ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes. Jinho stood beside her in a dark suit, reciting the required words with the same flat efficiency he brought to business negotiations, and when the moment came for him to take her hand, his grip was correct, but utterly without warmth, the handshake of two people closing a deal rather than beginning a marriage. Renee repeated her own lines when prompted, her voice steady even as something inside her quietly closed a door. Renee's father cried during the ceremony, though whether from relief or guilt she could not tell, and she found she did not have the energy to ask, watching him instead from the corner of her eye, a man who looked both lighter and more broken than she had ever seen him. Afterward, at the small reception that followed, Jinho's relatives offered congratulations that felt more like commentary, murmured comments about her family's circumstances, about how fortunate she was that the Han family had been willing to overlook certain deficiencies, delivered just quietly enough that Renee could not be certain she was meant to hear them, and just loudly enough that she always did. She did not cry. She smiled where a smile was expected, accepted congratulations that were not really congratulations, and understood with growing clarity that this room, this family, this marriage, had already decided exactly what she was worth before she had ever walked through the door. Jin-ho found her near the edge of the gathering, as the evening wound down. The first time all night he had approached her without an audience watching, his expression unreadable in the low light of the hall. "You did well tonight," he said, and for a moment she almost mistook it for kindness. "I was performing exactly the role I was told to perform," she said. "That is not the same thing as doing well." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Perhaps not," he said, "but it will serve you here regardless." He walked away before she could answer, leaving her standing alone at the edge of a celebration that had never once been about her, in a family that had already made clear she was tolerated rather than welcomed, married to a man who spoke of her performance rather than her person. Renee looked out across the room at the Han family, laughing and toasting among themselves, and understood with a cold, settling certainty that whatever came next in this marriage, she would have to survive it entirely on her own. Renee's room in the Han household was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that received little afternoon light, a space clearly not intended for anyone whose comfort mattered. The staff who unpacked her belongings that first week were efficient but distant, offering none of the warmth she imagined a new bride might expect, and when she asked one young woman named Hannah where she might find fresh towels, the girl glanced toward the main house before answering, as though checking whether it was even permitted to help her. "You will find them in the cabinet by the bathroom," Hannah said quietly. "I am sorry. I was told not to spend too much time attending to your room specifically." "Told by whom?" Renee asked. Hannah's eyes dropped to the floor. "I should get back to my other duties," she said, and left before Renee could press further. Jin-ho, for his part, was polite whenever their paths crossed, which was not often. He left early each morning and returned late, sometimes not at all, offering brief explanations about business matters that required his attention in other cities. "I will be away again tonight," he told her one evening, adjusting his cufflinks in the hallway mirror without quite looking at her. "There is a shipment matter in the southern port that requires my presence." Renee stood in the doorway of what was technically their shared quarters, though she had slept there perhaps 4 nights out of the last 3 weeks. "Will you be back before the weekend?" she asked. Not because she particularly wanted him there, but because she had begun to notice how thoroughly his absence left her exposed to the rest of his family. "I am not certain," he said. "I will send word if my plans change." He left without further explanation, and Renee stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of his car pulling away from the estate, before she made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where at least the staff, even if instructed to keep their distance, did not actively make her feel unwelcome. The dining room told a different story entirely. Dinner, with Jin-ho's mother and younger sister, on the nights Renee was expected to attend, had become a quiet exercise in endurance. "That dress is new," Jin-ho's sister, Sora, observed one evening, studying Renee's simple navy dress, with an expression that suggested she had already decided it was inadequate, before Renee had even sat down. "Did you have it made, or is that simply how they dress where you are from?" Renee kept her voice level. "It was a gift from my mother, before she passed," she said. "I have had it for several years." Sora exchanged a brief look with her mother, the kind of look that required no words to convey its meaning. "How resourceful," she said, turning her attention back to her plate. Jin-ho's mother, a woman named Madame Yun, rarely addressed Renee directly at all, preferring instead to speak about her as though she were not present in the room. "I heard her father's business nearly collapsed entirely before this marriage was arranged," she said to Sora, cutting her food with precise, unhurried movements. "It is fortunate for her family that our family was willing to overlook such circumstances." Renee set down her fork carefully, keeping her expression neutral, even as something hot and humiliated rose in her chest. My father built that business from nothing, she said quietly. Circumstances beyond his control nearly cost him everything he worked for. Madame Yun did not look up from her plate. Circumstances, she repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it distasteful. That is one way to describe poor judgment, I suppose. Renee glanced toward the head of the table, where Jin-ho sat in silence, his attention fixed on his own plate, offering no correction, no defense, nothing at all. She waited a moment longer, giving him the chance to say something, anything, but he simply reached for his water glass and took a slow drink, as though the conversation happening beside him required no response from him whatsoever. You have nothing to say? Renee asked him directly, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Jin-ho finally looked at her, his expression carefully neutral. This is a private family matter, he said. It is not necessary for me to involve myself in every conversation at this table. I am your wife, Renee said. I would think that makes me part of this family, not simply a subject for discussion. A brief, uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Sora's eyes flicked between her brother and Renee with poorly concealed interest, and Madame Yun's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though whether from anger or simple distaste, Renee could not tell. Perhaps we should finish dinner without further commentary, Jin-ho said finally, his tone even, offering neither apology nor support, simply a request that the discomfort end so the meal could continue undisturbed. Renee finished the rest of her dinner in silence, and when she returned to her room that night, she found herself staring at the ceiling, much the way she had the night before her wedding, except now the uncertainty of her future had curdled into something closer to grief, for a life she had not yet fully lost, but could feel slipping regardless. The following week, she received a call from her father that she had been both anticipating and dreading. "How are things settling?" he asked, his voice carrying a forced brightness that did not quite mask the exhaustion underneath it. "They are settling," Renee said carefully, unwilling to burden him further with the details of Madame Yun's dinner table cruelties. "How is the business? Are things improving now that the debt has been addressed?" There was a pause on the line long enough that Renee felt her stomach tighten before he even answered. "It is complicated," her father said finally. "The debt itself was forgiven, as promised, but there were additional terms attached to the arrangement that I did not fully understand until the paperwork was finalized. Terms about exclusive shipping arrangements with Han-affiliated partners. Terms about approval requirements for any new contracts I wish to pursue." Renee felt something cold settle in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in her father's study the night he signed the original contract. "What does that mean, practically?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "It means the business is no longer entirely mine to run as I see fit," her father admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded uncomfortably close to shame. "I am free of the original debt, but I find myself bound to the Han family's interests in ways I did not anticipate. Every major decision now requires their approval. Every new contract must go through channels I do not control." Renee closed her eyes, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that the marriage had not freed her family at all, only restructured the nature of their obligation into something quieter and more permanent. "They did not release you from the debt," she said slowly. "They simply converted it into something that benefits them indefinitely instead of once." Her father did not answer immediately, and his silence confirmed what neither of them wanted to say aloud. "I did not realize," he said finally, his voice small in a way she had never heard from him before. "I believed I was protecting you and securing our future in the same act. I am beginning to understand I may have only accomplished the first of those, and even that imperfectly." Renee sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after they said their goodbyes, staring out the window of her third-floor room at the manicured gardens below. Gardens she was welcome to look at, but had never once been invited to walk through, and she began to understand that whatever pain she had already endured in this house was only the beginning of a debt that had never truly been forgiven at all, only transferred, quietly and permanently, onto her back instead of her father's. The Han family's annual gathering took place in the grand ballroom of a hotel Renee had only ever seen photographed in magazines. all marble floors and towering floral arrangements, filled with men in tailored suits and women dripping in jewelry that likely cost more than her father's entire shipping fleet. Renee had dressed carefully for the evening, choosing a deep emerald gown that felt elegant without being showy, and she had allowed herself a small, private hope that tonight might be different, that surrounded by his peers, Jin-ho might finally treat her as something closer to a partner than an obligation. That hope lasted precisely as long as it took him to introduce her. "This is Renee," he said to the first cluster of associates they approached, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back, in a gesture that felt more like stage direction than affection. "She joined the family recently." The associates nodded politely, offered brief pleasantries, and returned almost immediately to their previous conversation, and Renee understood within the first 10 minutes of the evening that this pattern would repeat itself throughout the night. Introductions so flat and perfunctory that she began to feel less like a wife and more like a piece of luggage Jin-ho was required to bring along. It grew worse when they reached the far side of the ballroom, where a woman in a stunning ivory gown stood surrounded by an attentive circle of Han family relatives, all of them laughing warmly at something she had said. Jin-ho's posture shifted subtly as they approached, something in his shoulders easing in a way Renee had never once seen in her presence. "Su-ah," he said, and there was warmth in his voice now, an entirely different register than the one he used with Renee, unmistakable even to a stranger. "It has been too long." The woman turned, her smile immediate and genuine. "Jin-ho," she said, reaching out to touch his arm with easy familiarity. "I was hoping you would be here tonight." Madame Yun appeared at Su-ah's side within moments, practically glowing with warmth Renee had never once witnessed, directed at herself. "Su-ah, darling, you look radiant," Madame Yun said, taking both of the woman's hands in her own. "It has been far too long since you visited the house." Renee stood slightly apart from the circle forming around this woman, watching as Jin-ho's entire family seemed to come alive in a way they never did in her presence, and she felt something small and humiliating settle in her chest as she realized none of them had thought to introduce her to Su-ah at all. "I am sorry," Renee said finally, stepping forward with as much composure as she could manage. "I do not believe we have met." Su-ah's eyes flicked over her with polite, unbothered curiosity. "Oh," she said, "you must be the new addition to the family. Jin-ho, you did not mention how lovely she was." The words themselves were not unkind, but something in the phrasing, the new addition to the family, spoken as though Renee were a piece of furniture recently acquired, made the humiliation sink deeper than an outright insult might have. "Renee is my wife," Jin-ho said, and though the words were technically accurate, his tone carried none of the warmth he had offered Su-ah only moments before. "Of course," Su-ah said smoothly, her smile never wavering. "How wonderful for you both." The conversation moved on quickly after that, old stories and shared history flowing easily between Su-ah and the rest of the Han family, and Renee found herself gradually eased toward the outer edge of the group, offered polite nods when she attempted to contribute but little genuine engagement, until eventually she excused herself entirely, retreating to a quiet table near the edge of the ballroom where she could watch the evening unfold from a safe distance. She spent nearly 40 minutes there alone, nursing a glass of wine she did not particularly want, watching her husband laugh easily with a woman who clearly belonged in this world, in a way she herself never would. It was during this quiet retreat that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. Two of Madame Yun's older relatives had settled at a nearby table, close enough that their conversation carried clearly over the low music, and Renee, unnoticed in her corner, found herself unable to look away once she caught the shape of what they were discussing. "It is a shame about Su-ah and Jin-ho," one woman said, sipping her champagne. "They would have made such a fitting match. Her family's connections alone would have secured us the northern trade routes outright." The other woman nodded knowingly. "Madame Yun still hopes for it," she said, her voice dropping slightly, though not quite low enough. This current arrangement was only ever meant to resolve the shipping debt quickly. Once the routes are fully secured and the Coleman family's usefulness runs its course, I expect the marriage will be quietly dissolved. Sua's family has already indicated they would welcome the match once circumstances allow. Renee felt the wineglass grow unsteady in her hand. It will need to be handled delicately, of course, the first woman said. But Madame Yun has managed more delicate situations than this. A quiet dissolution, perhaps framed as an unfortunate incompatibility. No one will think twice about it in a year or two. And the girl's family, the second woman asked, will they cause difficulty? The first woman laughed softly, without any real concern in the sound. What could they possibly do? They will still be bound by the shipping agreements regardless of what happens to the marriage itself. That was always the more important arrangement. The marriage was simply the mechanism to secure it quietly, without the appearance of a hostile takeover. Renee set her wineglass down with careful, deliberate control, though her hands were not entirely steady, and she rose from the table and walked toward the nearest exit, before either woman could notice she had heard every word. She found Jin-ho nearly 20 minutes later, standing alone on a private balcony off the main ballroom, the noise of the party muffled behind glass doors, and something in her expression must have warned him before she even spoke, because his easy warmth from earlier in the evening had already begun to fade. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly," Renee said, her voice steadier than she felt. Jin-ho turned to face her fully, his expression guarded. "What is it? Is this marriage temporary?" she asked. "Was it always intended to be dissolved once my father's shipping routes were fully secured, so your family could pursue a more advantageous match with Sua instead?" Something shifted behind Jin-ho's eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by his usual composure, and the delay before he answered told her nearly as much as any words could have. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, which was not a denial. "I asked you a direct question," Renee said, refusing to let him redirect. "I am asking you to give me a direct answer." Jin-ho was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth she had witnessed with Sua, only a careful, practiced evasion. "These are decisions my mother makes regarding the family's long-term interests," he said. "It is not my decision to make alone." "That is not an answer," Renee said. "That is a man refusing to say a difficult truth out loud, because it is easier to hide behind his mother's authority than to admit what he already knows." Jin-ho's expression hardened slightly, though whether from anger or discomfort, she could not tell. "I did not draft the terms of this arrangement," he said. "I inherited a family with its own expectations and its own plans, the same as you did when you agreed to this marriage." "I did not agree to anything," Renee said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "I was handed to your family like a payment on an invoice. And now I am learning that even that payment has an expiration date, one your family intends to enforce whenever it becomes convenient for them." Jin-ho did not deny it. He looked away instead, out over the city lights beyond the balcony railing, his silence stretching long enough that it answered the question more completely than any words could have. "So it is true," Renee said quietly, something inside her going very still and very cold. "You knew this the entire time. You knew when you sat across from my father shaking his hand. You knew on our wedding day. You have known every single night you have left this house and told me it was business, when you could have told me the truth instead." "It is not entirely as simple as you are describing it," Jin-ho said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the words land as a real defense. "Then make it simple for me," Renee said. "Tell me plainly. Will your family end this marriage once my father's business is fully bound to yours, so that you are free to marry the woman your mother actually wanted for you?" Jin-ho did not answer, and the silence between them stretched out over the balcony like something physical, heavy and undeniable, and Renee understood in that silence exactly what kind of protection she could expect from her husband when it truly mattered, which was to say, none at all. "I see," she said finally, and turned back toward the ballroom doors, leaving him alone on the balcony, with the city lights, and whatever guilt he may or may not have actually felt. She did not cry that night either. She had begun to understand that tears would not change anything in this house. that the only thing that might change anything at all was patience and precision and the slow, careful gathering of whatever leverage she could find in a world that had never once considered her worth protecting. 2 weeks after the gathering, Renee sat alone in her third-floor room when her phone rang with her father's name on the screen, and something in the timing of the call, mid-afternoon on a weekday, when he should have been at the office, made her stomach tighten before she even answered. "Renee," her father said, and his voice broke on her name in a way she had never heard before. "What happened?" she asked, already rising from her chair. "The Hahn family called in the remainder of the shipping agreement early," he said, his words coming fast and unsteady. "They claimed a breach of contract terms I did not even know existed until this morning. Terms buried so deep in the original paperwork my own lawyer missed them during review." Renee gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of breach?" "An exclusivity clause," he said. "I accepted a smaller contract from a competing shipping partner 3 weeks ago. A routine arrangement, nothing that should have violated anything, but apparently the original agreement required approval for any outside contracts regardless of size. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know." "And now," Renee asked, though she already dreaded the answer, "and now they have seized the roots entirely," her father said, his voice cracking further. "The business is gone, Renee. Everything I built, everything your mother and I spent our lives building. It is gone, and I do not even understand how it happened so quickly." Renee closed her eyes, feeling something inside her go very quiet and very still, the last fragile thread of hope she had been holding on to finally snapping clean. "They promised this marriage would protect you," she said. "They promised the debt was forgiven. They promised many things," her father said bitterly. "I understand now that all of it was designed to look like mercy, while it was actually something else entirely. I am sorry, Renee. I am so sorry I believed them. I am sorry I believed this would save either of us." Renee sat with the phone pressed to her ear long after her father had finished speaking, listening to him apologize in increasingly broken fragments. And when the call finally ended, she remained perfectly still in her chair for a long while, staring at nothing, feeling the last version of herself that still hoped for decency from this family quietly die somewhere in her chest. She did not cry. She had expected to cry, had braced herself for the kind of grief that might finally break through her careful composure. But instead, what came was something colder and far more useful. That evening, when Madame Yun made a passing comment at dinner about the unfortunate turn in the Coleman family's business fortunes, delivered with the same practiced disinterest she brought to every insult, Renee did not respond with the wounded silence she had offered in previous weeks. "I heard," Renee said simply, cutting a piece of food with careful precision. "Business can be unpredictable." Madame Yun glanced up, visibly startled by the flatness of the response, clearly expecting tears or at least visible distress. "Yes," she said slowly. "Well, these things happen." "They did," Renee agreed, and offered nothing further, continuing her meal in a silence so composed it seemed to unsettle the table more than any outburst could have. Sora exchanged a glance with her mother, and Jin Ho, seated at the head of the table, studied Renee with an expression she could not quite read, something between confusion and wariness, as though he sensed a shift in her he did not yet understand. "You seem unbothered," Sora observed, an edge of provocation in her voice, as though testing for a crack that might still be exploited. "I am simply choosing not to perform grief for an audience that has never once shown me any genuine concern," Renee said evenly, meeting Sora's eyes directly. "I imagine you will all find that far less entertaining than the alternative." The table fell silent, and Renee finished her meal without further comment, rising afterward to return to her room with the same composed grace she had maintained throughout, leaving behind a family that did not quite know what to make of a woman who had stopped reacting the way they expected her to. It was nearly midnight, several hours later, when Renee found herself unable to sleep, restless in a way that felt less like grief and more like a mind actively working through a problem it had not yet solved. She rose from her bed and made her way quietly down to Jin Ho's study on the second floor, a room she had rarely entered, drawn there by an instinct she did not fully understand until she was already standing in front of his desk. The room was empty. Jin-ho was away again, some business matter in another city, and the household staff had long since retired for the night, leaving the study dark except for the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Renee was not entirely certain what she was looking for when she began opening drawers, only that some instinct told her the truth of what had happened to her father's business would not simply be spoken aloud in this house, and if she wanted real answers, she would need to find them herself. The desk yielded little at first. Ordinary business correspondence, shipping schedules, nothing that confirmed what she already suspected. It was in the bottom drawer, beneath a false panel she nearly missed entirely, that she found a slim folder marked only with a date, the same date as her wedding. Inside were documents she was not meant to see. The original shipping agreement, far longer and more detailed than the version her father had described to her, containing clauses buried deep within pages of dense legal language, an exclusivity requirement, so broadly worded, it could be triggered by almost any independent business decision her father might reasonably make without realizing he had violated anything at all. Beneath the contract was a second document, an internal memo dated weeks before the wedding, outlining what appeared to be a full projection of the Coleman shipping route's value once fully absorbed into Han family operations, alongside a timeline, marriage to be finalized within the month, exclusivity terms to be enforced within 1 fiscal year, full route absorption projected within 18 months of the initial agreement. There was a third document that made Renee's hands go cold as she read it. A brief exchange of correspondence between Madame Yun and an unfamiliar name, discussing the marriage explicitly as a temporary mechanism, language that mirrored almost exactly what she had overheard at the gathering weeks earlier, confirming in writing what she had only suspected from gossip. This had never been an act of mercy. It had never even been a genuine alliance. It had been a calculated extraction, designed from the very beginning to strip her father of everything he had built, while using her own marriage as the quiet mechanism to make it look like generosity rather than theft. Renee sat alone in the dark study for a long time, the folder open in her lap, reading each document twice, memorizing dates and figures and names, and when she finally closed the folder and returned it carefully to its hiding place beneath the false panel, exactly as she had found it, something fundamental had shifted inside her. She was no longer a woman waiting to discover what would happen to her. She was a woman who now understood precisely what had been done to her family, by whom, and exactly how deliberately it had been planned. Renee rose from the desk and walked back through the dark house toward her room, and for the first time since her wedding day, she did not feel like a victim standing at the edge of someone else's celebration. She felt, for the first time, like someone quietly beginning to calculate the cost of what was owed to her, and precisely how she intended to collect it. Renee spent the following week doing something she had never quite mastered before this marriage, which was watching everything and saying almost nothing at all. She learned the household's rhythms in a way she had never bothered to before, which staff arrived early, which rooms Jin-ho used for private calls, when Madame Yun typically met with her own advisors, and she began, carefully and without any outward sign of purpose, to make herself useful in small ways that granted her access she had not previously had. "I could help organize the correspondence for the upcoming quarter," Renee offered one afternoon, finding Madame Yun's assistant, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Cho, struggling under a stack of filing in the estate's business office. "I have some experience with organization from helping my father's company." Mr. Cho glanced up, surprised, but not unwelcoming. "That would be most helpful," he said. "Madame Yun has not authorized additional help, but I do not see the harm in a few hours of your time, if you are willing." Renee smiled, warm and unthreatening. "I would be glad to help however I can," she said, and over the following days, she made herself a quiet, reliable presence in the business office, filing correspondence, organizing invoices, and in the process, gaining access to records she would never have been permitted to see directly. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she found the name that would change everything, scrawled in the corner of an old invoice related to the original shipping contract, a signature belonging to a junior associate at the law firm that had drafted the agreement, a man named David Okafor. Renee recognized the surname immediately. David Okafor had attended the same university as her father, decades earlier, and though she had never met the man personally, she remembered her father mentioning him once in passing, a mutual acquaintance from those years who had gone on to practice corporate law. She found his contact information through a discreet inquiry to her father, framed carefully as simple curiosity about old family connections, and arranged to meet him at a quiet cafe, far from anywhere the Hahn family might notice her absence. David Okafor was a composed man in his 50s, sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses, who studied Renee carefully across the small cafe table before speaking. "Your father mentioned you might reach out," he said. He did not say why. "I need to understand something about the contract your firm drafted for the Hahn and Coleman shipping agreement," Renee said, keeping her voice low. "I have reason to believe the exclusivity clause was written deliberately vague, in a way designed to guarantee an eventual breach, regardless of my father's intentions." David was quiet for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral in the particular way of a man accustomed to discretion. "I was not the lead attorney on that contract," he said eventually, "but I did review portions of it before it was finalized, and I recall raising concerns internally about the breadth of certain clauses. I was told the language reflected the client's specific wishes, and it was not my place to question it further." "Do you still have access to your firm's records from that period?" Renee asked. David studied her for a long moment. "What exactly are you hoping to do with this information?" he asked carefully. "I intend to prove that this marriage, and the contract behind it, was constructed deliberately to extract everything of value from my family, while offering nothing genuine in return," Renee said. "Not incompetence, not an unfortunate circumstance. Deliberate, calculated theft, dressed up as an alliance." David leaned back slightly, something shifting in his expression, a flicker of quiet respect beneath the caution. "That is a serious accusation," he said, "and a difficult one to prove without solid documentation." "I already have some," Renee said. "I need help understanding how to use it properly, and whether there are others within the firm who might be willing to confirm what you have just told me, if it became necessary." David was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "Your father was kind to me once, many years ago, when I needed it," he said finally. "I have not forgotten that, even if he has. I will look into what records still exist. I cannot promise anything beyond that." "That is more than I had an hour ago," Renee said. "Thank you." Over the following 2 weeks, Renee continued her quiet work in the Hahn family's business office, gathering what she could, cross-referencing dates and figures against the documents she had already found in Jinho's study, building a picture far more complete than the one she had assembled alone that first night in the dark. She tested her new composure carefully during this period as well, watching for opportunities to demonstrate, in small and deniable ways, that she was no longer the passive presence she had been in the marriage's early weeks. At a family dinner one evening, Sora made a comment about a business matter Renee happened to know was being deliberately mishandled by one of Madame Yun's assistants, and rather than staying silent as she once might have, Renee offered a correction so precise and so clearly informed that the table fell into an uncomfortable, assessing silence. "You seem to know a great deal about our business affairs lately," Madame Yun observed, her tone carrying a new note of wariness Renee had not heard before. "I have been helping Mr. Cho with correspondence," Renee said simply. "I find it interesting work." Madame Yun's eyes narrowed slightly, though she said nothing further, and Renee understood from the tightness around the older woman's mouth that she had, for the first time, made this family genuinely uneasy about her, and that the feeling was, at long last, a satisfying one. Jinho found her alone on the terrace, later that same evening, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen since the balcony conversation weeks earlier. "You have changed," he said, without preamble. I have simply stopped performing for people who never intended to treat me fairly, Renee said, not looking away from the darkened garden below. Jin-ho was quiet for a moment. My mother believes you are planning something, he said. Your mother is not wrong to be concerned, Renee said evenly, finally turning to meet his eyes. Though I imagine she assumes I lack the means to act on it. I would not make that same assumption, if I were you. Something flickered across Jin-ho's face, uncertainty layered over something that might have been the beginning of real concern, though whether for his family or for her, Renee could no longer tell, and found she no longer particularly cared to guess. The Han family's spring gala took place in the same grand ballroom as the gathering months earlier. The same marble floors and towering floral arrangements, the same collection of business partners and syndicate allies whose respect Madame Yun valued above nearly everything else in her carefully constructed world. Renee wore a deep charcoal gown this time, sharp and composed rather than soft, and she carried a slim folder in a small clutch, documentation now fully corroborated by 2 associates at a law firm who had been willing, quietly, to confirm everything she had first suspected weeks earlier. Jin-ho had noticed her composure shift again in the days leading up to the gala, a coiled readiness she made no particular effort to hide, but he had said nothing further about it, and Renee suspected he had simply chosen, as he always did, not to ask questions whose answers might require him to act. The evening unfolded much as the previous gathering had. Madame Yun moved through the crowd with practiced warmth, greeting business allies and extended family with the same performative grace Renee had once mistaken for genuine feeling, and Renee positioned herself carefully near the center of the room, close enough to the gathering's most influential guests to ensure her voice, when it came, would carry. She waited until the room had settled into its natural rhythm, until Madame Yun stood at the center of a wide circle of her most valued allies, mid-conversation with a man Renee recognized from her research as the head of a major shipping consortium the Han family had spent years courting. "Excuse the interruption," Renee said, stepping into the circle with calm, deliberate steps. "I believe there is something this gathering should know before any further business is conducted tonight." Madame Yun's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked by irritation. "Renee, this is not the appropriate moment," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "I disagree," Renee said, opening the folder in her hands. "I think this is precisely the moment, given how many of the people in this room are currently considering new agreements with your family." She held up the first document, the original shipping contract with its deliberately buried exclusivity clause, highlighted in her own careful hand. "This is the agreement drafted between the Han family and my father's shipping company," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quieting circle of guests. "Presented to my father as debt forgiveness, in exchange for my marriage into this family." What he was not told was that the exclusivity terms were written broadly enough to guarantee an eventual breach, regardless of his intentions. "Renee," Jin-ho said, appearing suddenly at the edge of the circle, his voice low and urgent. "Not here." Renee did not look at him. "This is exactly here," she said, and held up the second document, the internal memo outlining the full timeline of the arrangement. "This is an internal projection, dated weeks before my wedding, outlining a full timeline for absorbing my father's shipping routes entirely into Han family operations, using the marriage itself as the mechanism to make the extraction appear voluntary." A murmur moved through the gathered guests, the shipping consortium executive leaning forward slightly, his expression shifting from polite interest to something sharper. "This is a fabrication," Madame Yun said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier composure. "I do not know where you obtained these documents, but I assure you, they have been altered." "They have not," Renee said calmly, and held up the third document, the correspondence discussing the marriage's intended dissolution. "This is correspondence from your own office, discussing this marriage explicitly as a temporary mechanism to be quietly dissolved once my father's shipping routes were fully absorbed, so that Jin-ho would be free to pursue a more advantageous match once my usefulness had run its course." The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence Renee had once experienced only as its target, and she found she felt no satisfaction in causing it, only a clean, cold clarity that this moment, finally, was doing what months of silent suffering had failed to accomplish. Jinho stepped forward now, his expression caught somewhere between panic and something that looked almost like shame. "This is not entirely accurate," he began, though his voice lacked conviction. "Which part is inaccurate?" Renee asked, turning to face him directly for the first time since she had begun speaking. "The contract, the memo, the correspondence, or simply the fact that everyone in this room is now seeing it for the first time?" Jinho said nothing, his jaw tight, and Renee watched something in his expression finally crack. Not quite an admission, but the visible collapse of a man who had spent months avoiding exactly this moment. "I trusted your family with my father's entire life's work," Renee said, turning back to address the wider circle of guests, her voice steady and clear. "I trusted this marriage would mean something, even as a business arrangement, even without affection. Instead, I discovered my family was never a partner in this arrangement at all. We were simply an asset to be extracted, quietly and efficiently, while being told at every step that this was mercy rather than theft." The shipping consortium executive, who had been mid-conversation with Madame Yun before Renee's interruption, cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral, but his tone unmistakably cool. "Madame Yun," he said, "I believe we will need to postpone our discussion regarding the new distribution agreement. I would like time to review some of what has just been presented here." Two other guests nearby exchanged low, uneasy glances, and Renee watched, with quiet satisfaction, as the careful web of respect and alliance Madame Yun had spent decades cultivating began, in real time, to visibly fray at its edges. "This is outrageous," Madame Yun said, her voice rising now, some of her composure finally slipping entirely. "You would destroy this family's reputation over a private business matter. There is nothing private about defrauding a man who trusted you," Renee said. "You made it public the moment you decided to use a wedding as the mechanism for that theft." Jinho stepped closer, his voice lower now, urgent in a way she had never heard from him. "Renee, please," he said. "Whatever you think of my mother, whatever has happened, we can address this privately. This does not need to happen in front of everyone." Renee looked at him for a long moment, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt nothing resembling the desperate hope she might once have carried for this exact kind of intervention, weeks or months earlier, when she had still believed he might someday choose to protect her. "I no longer need you to address anything," she said. "I no longer need your protection, your defense, or your permission to speak the truth in front of the people whose respect your family values above almost everything else. I needed that months ago, when your silence at your mother's table might have meant something. Tonight, I simply needed witnesses, and I have them." She closed the folder calmly and turned to address the gathered guests one final time. "I imagine some of you will want to review your own agreements with the Han family in light of what you have just seen," she said. "I would encourage it." She walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving behind a room full of murmured conversation, a mother whose careful reputation had just visibly cracked in front of the people she valued most, and a husband standing frozen at the center of it all, having finally chosen, far too late, to defend her, only to discover his defense was no longer required. By the following week, two of the Han family's most significant pending agreements, including the shipping consortium deal, had been formally withdrawn, and whispers of the scandal had spread quietly but thoroughly through the circles that mattered most to Madame Yun's carefully constructed standing. The damage was not total, not overnight, but it was real, and it was permanent in the way that reputations, once cracked in front of the right witnesses, rarely fully recover, and Renee, watching it unfold from the quiet distance of her third-floor room, felt something settle inside her that was not quite peace, but was, at long last, something close to justice. 3 weeks after the gala, Renee sat across from a lawyer in a quiet downtown office. Not David Pierce this time, but a divorce attorney recommended by one of the very same consortium executives who had withdrawn his agreement with the Han family that night. I want the dissolution finalized cleanly, Renee said, sliding a folder of her own documentation across the desk. And I want the original shipping agreement between my father and the Han family voided entirely, on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. My father's business, and its roots, should never have been contingent on this marriage in the first place. The attorney reviewed the documents carefully, nodding as she turned each page. Given what is already circulating about the Han family's conduct, she said, this should not be difficult to argue. I suspect they will settle quickly, simply to avoid further public exposure. That is precisely what I am counting on, Renee said. Jin-ho requested to see her only once during the proceedings, and she agreed to meet him, not out of any lingering hope, but because she found she wanted him to see, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly who she had become. I did not know how to fight my mother, he said, sitting across from her in a quiet cafe, far removed from anything resembling the Han family's usual world. I told myself that was the same as not having a choice. It was never the same thing, Renee said evenly. You had a choice every single night you left me alone in that house. You simply chose the version of peace that cost you nothing, while it cost me everything. Jin-ho did not argue the point, which told her more than any apology could have. Is there anything I can do now? He asked quietly. Anything that would matter. Renee considered the question honestly, turning it over before she answered. You can sign the settlement without dragging this out further, she said. That is the only thing that would matter to me at this point. Not because I need it, because it would be the first genuinely decent thing you have done in this entire arrangement, and I would like to see you capable of it, even once. He signed within the week. The settlement, once finalized, restored her father's shipping routes fully, with damages substantial enough to rebuild the business stronger than it had been before the original debt. And word of the Han family's conduct continued to spread through the same circles that had once respected them most, costing them 2 additional partnerships before the year was out. Renee did not return to her father's house, not permanently. Instead, she used a portion of the settlement to establish something of her own, a small consulting firm advising other families navigating business arrangements exactly like the one that had nearly destroyed hers, built specifically to catch the kind of buried clauses that had cost her father everything the first time. Her father visited her new office on its opening day, standing in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. I do not know how to thank you for what you did, he said. I do not know if I deserve it. After everything my decisions cost you. You did not do this to me, Renee said gently. They did. You were deceived the same as I was. The difference is that I found a way to make them answer for it, and I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure fewer families have to learn that lesson the way we did. Her father crossed the room and embraced her, and for the first time since the night he had signed away her future in his study, Renee felt something settle fully into place, not forgiveness for what had happened, but peace with what she had built from its wreckage. She stood at the window of her new office that evening after he left, looking out over a city that had once made her feel small and disposable, and understood, with quiet, settled certainty, that whatever this marriage had taken from her, she had ultimately taken back more than it had ever cost, on her own terms, answering to no one. If her family's half a lifetime of pain had purchased anything at all, it had purchased this, a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission, protection, or approval to determine her own worth. If this story means anything to you, tell me in the comments what you think justice should actually cost the people who inflict pain like this. Tell me about a moment you finally stopped waiting for someone else to defend you. Drop where you are watching from tonight. And if this is the first time our story has found you, subscribe. It means so much to us,